Check, check, mic check. Check, check, mic check. Welcome to Podcast Envy. I'm your podcast boss, Andrea Klender. Today, you are going to learn, as my SEO tested title promises, how to be an awesome podcast host. And you don't have to take advice from me for once. I brought the amazing Karen Yates from Wild Sublime into my Squadcast recording studio to create a masterclass for my studio members and clients at the Creative Imposter Studios. Skill development masterclasses is one of the key benefits of working with our agency for strategy, production, and editing. And today, I am giving you a sneak peek. Now, it's not the whole class, it's just a portion. And I have good news for you. The whole class is available for you as a private audio podcast, and you can purchase that class right now at thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. Once again, that's thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. So if you already know that you want the whole conversation that Karen and I have, and you want all those tips and tricks and behind the scenes insights and strategies and solutions, then don't listen to this episode. There's no point. Go right now to thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host and get that full class and listen to that. But if you're not sure, if you're on the fence about it, far be it from me to do some kind of heavy-handed sales pitch. You are going to get a ton of value and a ton of great ideas that you can implement right now into creating your podcast by listening to this episode with Karen. We are going to talk about everything from pre-production before you press record, to production while you're recording, to post-production and editing, and some mindset things. You know, I chose Karen specifically for this class, partly because we have a shared history of sorts in theater, in performance, in acting, in crafting entertaining and engaging live experiences and also recorded experiences for an audience. And there is so much that we can learn from the theater world that goes into the skills of being an awesome podcast host. Now, you might be thinking, but Andrea, I don't have theater training. I don't have a background in theater. I am not an actor. I am not a performer. Karen says that there is a fair amount of performance that goes into being an effective an engaging host. And you might be thinking, but I don't want to perform. I don't want to act. I want to be authentic. I want the conversation to flow naturally. I want things to feel organic. And I will tell you that as a recorded piece of media, specifically for someone to listen to and consume, part of your job is to entertain that person. And we've talked about that on some of the recent episodes of Podcast Envy. We've been talking about how the number one and number two reason why a human listens to a podcast is to learn something new and to be entertained. And if you are missing out on one of those two things, if you're just being like wildly entertaining, but you're not actually teaching them anything or enlightening them about anything new, then you're missing out on half the equation. And if you're just teaching really useful content, but you're boring, then you are also missing out on maybe more than half of your opportunity here. I will tell you that I look for podcasts when I want to learn something new, when I want to find out more about a particular topic. Like recently, I've been digging into learning more about PR and PR strategy. And so I looked up all the podcasts I could find that are about PR, and I probably found 8 different shows. There are more, but I added 8 shows that looked promising, that had current content and had episode titles that looked like what I wanted to learn. I added them to my podcast queue, and then I started playing each one. And within about 15 to 20 seconds, maybe 30 seconds at the most, I knew whether I was deleting that one and moving on to the next show or whether I was going to continue to listen to that one. And so I have narrowed it down to only 2 podcasts now that I am binging their episodes because I am learning what I want to learn. It's delivering on that educational promise, but also It's entertaining. The sound quality is good. The host is capturing my attention and engaging with me in the way that makes it enjoyable to listen and learn something new. And it doesn't make it feel like a research project. And so that is what we're doing. And if you do not have a theater background, you can learn these skills. I mean, there was a point at which I did not have a theater background and I didn't know these skills. I think it was when I was still in the womb. I think I immediately started learning performance skills when I was born. So I can't really remember that time. I can't promise. But you can learn these things. You do not have to be an actor. You do not have to be a performer. You do not have to have a theater background. But there is a lot that you can learn that will help you to become a more entertaining and engaging host when delivering your content via podcast. All right. That was a very long, slightly improvised spiel. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope it was useful. And now, without any further ado, I would love to welcome Karen Yates. Welcome to Podcast Envy Special Edition. That's what one of my high school students in my podcasting program likes to say. Every time we do something unexpected or out of the norm, he says, Special Edition. So, this is a special edition. I'm here with Karen Yates, the producer and host and mastermind behind the podcast Wild and Sublime. And I'm actually sitting here, Karen. My coffee mug today is Chicago Scriptworks.
Oh my God. This is how we met.
Yes, this is how we first met long ago, before, I'm going to say probably before I knew what a podcast was.
Well, I don't even know if podcasts existed because it was about 22 years ago. No, it was about 20 years ago, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, I don't know if they existed. If they did, probably they had to be like coded by hand by somebody super techie in a basement somewhere. I'm not sure. But that's how Karen and I first met. And that was in the context of theater, film, the creative arts in Chicago, storytelling. And Karen directed some staged readings of original screenplays for sort of like a part competition, part workshop thing. That was a little bit my first foray into entrepreneurship, because we started a legit 501c3 nonprofit organization, as you do in Chicago when you want to do something creative and no one will hire you to do it. You just do it yourself.
When capitalism shuns you.
Yes, correct. But we're not here to talk about screenplays or theater. Maybe we will.
Maybe we will.
We're here to talk about podcasting and specifically host skills. Why don't you give us a little bit of background into what is Wild and Sublime and why on earth do you create it?
The Wild and Sublime podcast is a podcast about inclusive sexuality that really works to divest shame around sexuality, since most of us do have, on some level, some part of us has shame around sexuality. It's an interview show. Sometimes it's panel discussion around various aspects of sexuality, but it's less about techniques when it comes to sex, and it's more about big picture. How do we communicate with each other? How do we create emotional intimacy? How do we create physical intimacy? And it covers a lot of different types of sexuality. So different types of relationships, like polyamorous or ethically non-monogamous relationships. It sometimes covers kink, LGBTQIA relationships, as well as, more heteronormative types of sexuality. But it's all under this banner of working with not only communication, but also connecting to the body on a more of a somatic level. So it's helping people become more aware of who they are on a body level.
So we were talking earlier about this topic of improving your skills as a podcast host and how sometimes it's kind of a hard sell, because a lot of podcasters get into podcasting as a form of self-expression. They feel they're already a confident and competent communicator. They're thinking about, how do I grow my show? How do I monetize my show? But very rarely are they thinking about, how do I become a better podcast host?
Yeah, you can say some of it's ego, because you and I have talked about the ego aspect before of like, I'm a great podcaster. I don't need to learn any skills.
But that's not anyone listening to this right now.
No, that's not anyone listening to this. I think some folks are like, well, I love talking with people. Ergo, if I'm a good conversationalist, I'm a good podcast interviewer. And I don't think they're exactly the same skill sets, because when you're in free-flowing conversation with a friend or an intimate, maybe you don't have an agenda. Maybe you're just doing it for pure enjoyment. But when you're interviewing someone, you're having to hold in your mind that you have an audience. And you're having to hold in your mind that you have an agenda for getting specific forms of information out to your audience, as well as making your interviewee comfortable so that they will yield these results that you want, as well as then monitoring your own, what's going on with you as an interviewer. So it becomes a lot more of a performance, if you will. It becomes more, there's the theater angle. It becomes, there's multiple agendas going on suddenly, whereas you don't have multiple agendas unless you're a highly manipulative person when you're talking to a pal.
That would be a whole other topic for a whole other day.
So yeah, control issues among friends. Okay, cheers.
So yes, you're holding multiple audiences and interests in your mind at the same time, because a lot of the people that we work with at the Creative Imposter Studios and a lot of our listeners of Podcast Envy and people in the community are podcasting not necessarily as a hobby, like it is part of a professional brand or business or on behalf of a company or even a nonprofit organization. So there is a reason why you're creating this piece of content. And we should back up a little bit and say that this topic is actually part of marketing. It's actually part of audience development and growing your show. Because I was telling Karen earlier, I was digging around in some research and some stats, and the number 1 and 2 reason why people listen to a podcast at all are entertainment and to learn something new. That's not really surprising to me. But what was surprising is the reason why they choose specific podcasts to keep listening to was because of the host. Because sometimes people focus on getting these big name guests or guests with a big following, and then they think that's what's going to grow their show. And really, it might attract someone to that particular episode who is seeking out more content from that particular guest, but they're only going to listen to that episode unless there is something compelling about the experience they have with the host that's like, I would like to follow this show. I would like to check out more episodes like this.
Well, it's interesting because we've been talking, and you actually had a session with me where you encouraged me to bring more of myself into the podcast, because I have this very visceral response to podcasts that I call it the natter factor, that people just natter on and on and on at the beginning of the podcast before they get to their guest. And a lot of times it bores the crap out of me. I don't find it entertaining. And so I'm like, I'm not going to do any of that. And so I kind of started erring on the side of like, no,
none,
absolutely nothing. And you're like, no, you got to give a little more. And so I have been a little more, opening up and sharing more vulnerable things like this, like right now.
Yeah. So, well, and let's talk about that, because I am also not a fan of the like chit chat, like here's what my husband and I did over the weekend. And I don't like the irrelevant natter that has nothing to do with why I clicked on the episode in the first place. So taking that out of it, what have you been experiencing or what have you been experimenting with to infuse more of yourself and your personality intentionally into those episodes? Like, how have you been thinking about that?
Well, when I set up the narrative that leads in, the pre-recorded narrative that leads into the interview, a lot of times I'll reflect on, how has this particular subject impacted me? Or, I was really excited when I saw that this book was coming out because I follow this person on Instagram and I always think that he has something very interesting to say. So I'll come in that way. But what tends to happen is I'm letting loose a little bit more in the interview and talking about my own sexual experiences and or relationship experiences or thoughts. So the conversation becomes a little more, so it's not like 100% spotlight on the guest. It's me giving some of my thoughts as well. So I would say it becomes weighted more like 30-70
Mm-hmm.
rather than, I don't ever want it to be 50-50, but it's more like 30-70. And that gives it a richer quality, I think, because then the guest is, in some ways, I feel like the guest can relax into pure conversation, knowing that I am actually, expressing some vulnerable things about myself. Then they relax, and then we start having more of a conversation. But the agenda is still there.
Yeah. So you're creating the container. There's some flexibility and some room for flow within there. So a little bit of behind the scenes of my process with working with Karen. Karen records her conversations and then sends the raw audio. We upload that into Descript, and then Karen does a first pass edit of the actual content. And I never actually look at that raw Descript versus the one that you say is ready for us to do our dialogue and sound edit on. So I don't know how much you actually take out of those episodes.
What I do cut is really embarrassing moments by me. Like oh, I forgot the name of your book. Or, oh, I totally mispronounced this famous expert in the field. So I will take out major flubs. But it's interesting, as I become more used to podcasting, I'm not rearranging as much. What does happen, though, is when the podcast ends, by now the guest we're totally relaxed. We're having a good time typically. What I will say now is, thank you so much. Just want to let you know I'm still recording because a lot of times nice things happen at this point. And we keep talking. And I mean, without fail, there's usually some major thing the guest says, which is awesome. And I will then take it and stick it into the podcast. That happens a lot.
It's time for our Podcast Angels segment. Podcast Angels are those companies, products, services, etc., who I know are going to make your podcasting experience so much more effective and enjoyable and entertaining. Maybe. You can be the judge. Today's Podcast Angels are Karen Yates and me. As I mentioned in the intro to this episode, this whole thing is an excerpt from a full-length Podcast Envy masterclass on hosting skills. Hosting skills sounds boring. Let's make it more entertaining by calling it How to Be an Awesome Podcast Host. I recorded this masterclass for my private clients in the Creative Imposter Studios. And if you want to get the full scoop on how to be an awesome podcast host from Karen and me, that's twice as much content as you're getting now. Dun, 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 dun. You can get it right now at thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. Once again, that's thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. It is linked for you oh so conveniently in the show notes, in the episode description, in your app. And now allow me to make a direct appeal to your sense of FOMO. It's for your benefit, trust me. What you are missing out on if you do not get this full masterclass is even more insight into Karen's pre-production, production, and post-production processes when creating Wild and Sublime. This includes her communications with the guest ahead of time and how she sets her guest up for success each and every time. Karen's signature episode style panel discussions, how to host and facilitate an effective and enjoyable panel discussion on your podcast, voice acting and self-care tips, how to work with your editor to create a system of communication that helps them read your mind, even if that editor is yourself, and how I think about my relationship with you. You want to know that part, don't you? Once again, you can get the full scoop at thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. And our next podcast angel is She Podcasts Live 2023. It is coming up in Washington, D.C., June 19 through 22. And I'm going to be there. I mean, you probably should be too, so that we can meet in person and hang out and talk about podcasting. And if you haven't gotten your ticket yet, never fear. I have a promo code for you to save $50 off your ticket. Join me, all one word, and then you can come to my session. Be the star of your show. So if you want to come hang out with me, be part of that workshop, find out how you can be the star of your show, in a good way, not an obnoxious way. I would love to see you there at She Podcasts Live 2023. Since we're talking a little bit about interactions with guests and relationship building with guests, let's go into this whole guest interview process a little bit more. Take me to the very beginning when you are selecting guests to reach out to be on the show. What goes into finding the perfect guests?
It's a couple of things. One thing that happens is if I suddenly see that a book is coming out that is like 100% my demographic, I will leap on it. Either I'll contact the publicist, I will go to the author's website, or in the back of my mind, I'm like, oh, I want to talk about this topic. And it'll just sort of sit in my mind until I come across on social media or through conversations with other experts, the perfect person, or I'll ask around, or I'll have an ad hoc topic and I have a bunch of recurring guests that I will then call in to talk about that particular topic.
So you have these recurring guests that come on and do panel discussions on different topics, usually questions that are submitted by people in your community. What are the qualities that you look for in a great panelist?
What I look for are people that have an opinion, and they don't have to be like aggressively opinionated, but that's not bad because, you can pull those sound bites out and make social media out of like people who are really have got a strong opinion and they're funny. Humor helps, but I like a mix of people who are very assertive and have got a very definite opinion. I love people who are softer, who are more introverted, and they'll just like lob this like bomb of an amazing comment, but it's a little more thought out. They speak a little more slowly. It's a mix of different types of personalities, but everyone needs to be relatively intelligent and play well with others. They need to be able to assert and then yield. And if they're not assertive, then I'll pull them in. Then I'll be like, hey, Bob, what do you have to say? Because I can always then cut the hey, Bob out of the podcast.
Yeah.
And so it sounds a little more organic. Like Bob's just jumping in with his opinion.
That's an interesting side note that's more about your relationship with your editor that I just want to highlight what Karen just said about directing the flow of the conversation by saying, hey, Bob, what are your thoughts? By the way, she has no panelist named Bob, so she's not picking on anyone in particular. But she'll say that. And then because of the relationship that Karen and I have with me as her primary editor, I know that those should be taken out. So Karen doesn't at this point even have to tell me to take those parts out because we've established a flow and a rhythm in the way that the show is edited. I know how she wants it to sound, and I'm listening for what sounds organic. And that's something that people say to me all the time about editing is they're like, oh, I don't want too much editing because I want it to sound really natural. Going back to your point about the fact that you're creating this conversation with the thought that someone is going to be listening to it later. So it's already not natural. And to actually make it sound and feel organic and natural to your listener, it actually sometimes takes a little bit of behind the scenes craft work.
Yeah.
Going back to interview guests, though, one more thing I wanted to talk about that I know is a priority for both you and I is how you think about diversity on your show.
Yeah, having a diverse range of folks on the podcast is hugely important to me. Frankly, it's a way more interesting conversation because, when you have diversity on your show, you're hearing from so many points of view that will generate rich conversations and surprising conversations and make you check your own privilege and check your own point of view. It becomes this thing of like, oh, doesn't everyone think this way? Well, no, they don't. And that's one of the important things. And it's not just about people of color. It's about, disability. It's about people who are gender fluid or gender nonconforming, people that have markedly different experiences than you. And you know what? We're all human. Let's just get on with it and have some conversations. I just had an episode called Hot Tips for Dating Trans and GNC People. GNC is gender nonconforming, with a sex and gender therapist. And let me tell you, this conversation was amazing because half the things the therapist, Ray McDaniel, was talking about were applicable to everybody, right? It's not just like a trans thing or a Black thing. It's like This is the universal human experience.
Now that we have, taken 20 minutes to select our guests. You choose the guest, you invite them, they say yes, you send them all the tech details, bam, you record, right?
No. I have an intake form, which is your name, how you want to be called on the podcast, how you to pronounce your name, your pronouns, how you identify, if you so choose to tell me, all of your social media handles, if you so choose to tell me, how you want to be described, a longer bio, any books you've been reading lately, which I never use, but I just included anyway, and then a release form. I know there's some podcasters don't use release forms, but I do.
Yeah,
I'm a big
I
believer in
recommend it.
them. And then I would say a couple of days before, I will send them bullet points of the topics and questions I'm going to ask. I don't stick to it super tightly, but I want to let the interviewee know, like, hey, this is what we're going to be talking about. I'm not going to zing you, out of the blue. This is how it's going to happen. And then, yeah, that's the pre-pro. That's the pre-pro.
I sometimes think about this because you do have a lot of authors on, and you always talk about what's in the book. And I've always thought about this with interviewers, like let's say Oprah or something. Are you reading the whole book every time you have a guest on before they come on? Like, how does that work?
I am reading the whole book.
Huh.
I am reading reading the whole book. Now, that said, if it is a really long book, and fortunately, sex books don't tend to be long because they want people to go have sex.
I was waiting for that punchline.
Right, but I will start skimming. If I kind of understand where the author is coming from, I kind of know their main point, I'll sort of skim near the end, full disclosure. But I like to read people's books. I like to see where they're coming from. And it does make for a better interview, I will say. And I do think Oprah most undoubtedly has an assistant that breaks down key major points, which make it look as though she did read the entire book.
But we don't know. We don't
be
produce
wrong.
Oprah's show.
Oprah, if you're listening, let us know.
Exactly. I'm sure. Once you've done that preparation, talk to me about in the recording session with your guests. How are you structuring that container? What are you thinking of? And what are some of the particular challenges that have come up in a recording situation?
So what I do is before the interview starts, I pull up a document that lives next to the Zoom recording that I'm doing. And it's a little bit different than what I have sent the guest. It includes more personal notes to myself about make sure you do this, or like must ask this, like everything's bold. Basically everything is bolded. I mean, it's kind of dumb, but the guest will come on and we'll do some chit chat before I hit record. It's just to kind of warm everything up and be like, and then I explain like, this is what we're about to do. And, at any point, if you want to say something again, I can always cut it out of, if you want to reframe something, love doing that, not a problem. And then we begin. And what I'm doing at that point is I'm just kind of taking a temperature read of what's our communication like. For really chatty, warm people or people that have been on numerous times, it's like, great. It's just like jumping into a warm pool. But for people that, some folks get on, I don't know them. They might be on an author tour. They're really tight. Mm-hmm. They're very tight. And then some people in general will give very tight responses. You'll ask them a question and they'll give you 3 sentences and then it will just drop off. And then there's silence. With those folks, that's like, oh, okay, it's going to be one of those. It's going to be one of those conversations. All right, okay, cool. I don't get upset. I'm like, all right, I'm just going to keep working with it. I'm just going to keep working with this energy, and I kind of stay in this place. And this is a theater thing. It's like when you're a performer in theater, you have an audience and you take reads of the audience. If it's a Sunday matinee, it's very sleepy. If it's a Saturday night, it usually tends to be revved. Well, you can't push against what is. And so it's like when you're dealing with a guest, you can't force it to go in a zone that it's not going to go in because this is who this person is. So it's more just about like accepting the energy of the guest, accepting what's going on, and then kind of dancing. You're dancing with the guest. You're basically dancing with the guest. And people do tend to, once they realize they can trust you as an interviewer, once they realize you're not self-serving or whatever, people do start relaxing. And then you can get into the improv of it.
Yeah, and sometimes there's those guests, where it's the opposite of answering the question succinctly with a few sentences and then just stopping. You have the opposite where they just go on and on and on. As the host, you're trying to figure out how they're just going to talk for 45 minutes. How do I interject myself into there?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, that does happen. It happens more frequently with people that have an agenda, like they're trying to sell something. And well, of course, we both know you can cut it out. You can cut it out in the edit, right? I tend to be very engaged with my guests. And so I'll be laughing and I'll be like, oh my God, I hear what you're saying. And then I'll like zip in. I'll be like, I know what you're saying. So anyway, what I really want to know here is, based on what you just said, which is so compelling.
Yeah.
That's how I usually handle it.
Yeah. I've been thinking a lot more intentionally about social media lately. Like most of us, it's kind of a love-hate relationship, but I'm feeling a teensy bit more experimental because of all the time I've been spending with Lauren Ramsey of Betsy Bash, my favorite social media and digital marketing agency. Lauren and I recently created an integrated podcast and social strategy service called The Creative Bash for podcasters like you who feel like you're spinning your wheels, not growing your show fast enough or consistently enough or sustainably enough, or you recognize that you're simply not getting the engagement and interaction that you want from your audience. You know they're there in theory, but sometimes you feel like you're shouting or podcasting, as it were, into the void. Over the next few episodes of Podcast Envy, you'll hear a brand new segment called the Creative Bash Starter, a quick tip or insight from Lauren and me, mostly Lauren, let's be honest, on aligning your content strategy between channels for a better overall experience. Once you've had a taste and you're ready to see the full menu, head to the show notes for a link to a quick interest form to request an invitation for a Creative Bash virtual tea with Lauren and me. We'll hang out together online for about 20 minutes and see if the Creative Bash is a good fit for you and your amazing show. Hey, Lauren from Betsy Bash.
Hello, hello.
I love doing interviews for my podcast, and I get some guests on who have really big audiences, but I feel like they don't always automatically share their episodes. What am I doing wrong? How can I get my guests to share their interviews on my show with their audience?
This is a huge one for anybody that's trying to promote anything, right? You want to get as many people to see or listen to your podcast as possible. So what you want to do is make it as easy as possible for your guest to do what you're asking them to do. So what I recommend is creating everything for them, right? So whatever you're going to promote, just give them those graphics and then also write the copy for them. So maybe as you're writing the copy for your social media posts, you can alter them a little bit from I interviewed so-and-so today to I was on so-and-so's podcast today, right? And that way, all they have to do really is copy, paste, upload an image. The other piece of that that's really important is following up, right? People have the best intentions. They're going to do it at the end of the day. They're going to do it when they have a second between meetings, and then they forget. So don't just ask once, ask a couple times, and also set the expectation from the beginning. Say when we have guests on our show, we really love for them to also share the interview and really start to build this community around the podcast, the episode, and the topic. Is that something you're willing to do? And then you already have their buy-in from the beginning.
What about tagging my guests?
You should definitely do that. Yeah, absolutely. So on Instagram, Facebook, and TikTok, you can tag people. And the great thing about that is if they respond to it, like let's say Facebook, for example, if you have a post, you tag them, they respond to it, that post is now going to be seen by their audience. And so it just continues to build. The more engagement that you get, the more people that see the post.
And I'm going to throw in a bonus tip, which is make sure that the episode sounds as good as possible so that they really want to share it, so that they are highlighted in a really awesome way through the quality of the audio and through the quality of the interaction and the conversation that you had with them. So making sure that it's content they actually want to share with their audience will go a long way.
100%.
So let's talk a little bit about voiceover narration. So one feature of Karen's show is that once she's recorded the panel or the interview, then she will go back and record an intro, as we talked about in the beginning. But she also has segments or interjections, just depending on what type of show it is and how much needs to be said in the narrative. And then there's also promos that roll in, sponsors, upcoming events, things like that. When you're recording the voiceover narration, What are some of the things that you think about?
Well, when the transcript of the recording comes out in Descript, or, then I also transcribe to Otter for my website, which is another accessibility thing. I believe strongly in transcripts, both for SEO, but also for people who are deaf. So when it comes out in Descript, what I then do is I just make a little list of everything I need to include in the narration. And then I'll just create a script. The other thing that's really important when I actually do the recording, I'm not doing it off the cuff. It is scripted, but I'm sometimes making it sound like it's off the cuff.
How do you do that?
How do I do that, Andrea? Well, I look and I'm like, oh, this is what I have to say. So it's like, oh, the Creative Imposter Studios. I'm like a more casual. I'm not reading it like the Creative Imposter Studios. I'm like giving it warmth. I'm smiling because when you smile as you record, it really changes the warmth factor of your recording, smiling.
Mm-hmm.
So that's like voiceover 101. I also make sure that I'm hydrated and that I haven't eaten a lot of dairy products, which can really add to the schmacula factor. Dairy adds mucus. Dairy adds a lot of mucus.
And I do think, just as a side note, that sometimes podcasters don't realize that as soon as you decide that you're going to create a show and you're going to be on the mic and you're going to be recording yourself, you are a voice professional at that moment. Like you have stepped into, if not being an actor, you are now a voice professional and your primary instrument is not your microphone. Your primary instrument is your voice.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it goes back to, I'm always thinking of it like entertainment equals enjoyment. So anytime you are putting an obstacle for them to enjoy listening to your show, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to stop listening, but you've just given them a reason to consider listening to a different show.
You're bringing up a really interesting point because there's some very popular podcasts in my field. So I try to listen to them, find out what's going on. And I'll hit the play button and the narrator will come on and their voice hits something in my ear. And I'm like, I can never listen to this person again.
Hey there, what do you think? Are you getting a ton of value from this episode? I just wanted to remind you one more time that you can get the full masterclass conversation with me and Karen Yates at thecreativeimposter.com/be an awesome host. That class has another 30 plus minutes of fantastic content for you that is going to help you to become a more effective, entertaining, and engaging podcast host for your show. And then the last thing that I want to talk about is going back to this idea of people listening to your show because of the host, because of you. Part of that is the experience they have when listening in terms of the sound quality, in terms of the content, in terms of the guests, in terms of the way the episode unfolds. But I think part of it also is the relationship. There's this weird thing that happens with podcasts specifically, where when you listen to a show enough, you feel like you have a relationship with the host, even though the host has never met you before, has no idea who you are, and you've never had a conversation. But if you met them in real life, you would feel like you already know them. Talk to me about how or if you think about your relationship with your listeners. Like, who are you to them?
That's a really great question. I like to think that if you listen to my podcast from beginning to end, you're going to know a lot about my sex life. Because, which is a very weird thing. That's very weird for me to contemplate. But I do have multiple personas within the podcast. I have the persona of, the narrator at the beginning, the voiceover. It's more of an NPR voice. It's a little more polished. I'm not usually going off of script very much. Then there is what happens in the interview. And then in that, I'm pivoting between, no, I really want to know this as a civilian. And I am keeping my audience in mind. And it's like, I feel like I'm one with the audience.
Yeah.
Like, what are you saying here? Like, tell me more. And then sometimes I feel like I'm a peer. Let's talk at a peer level. And then sometimes it totally devolves into entertainment and like we're cutting each other up and we're laughing a lot. And sometimes I think, is the audience cool with this? Like I was an NPR person like a couple of minutes ago, but now I'm talking about going to a sex party and I'm like laughing hysterically with my fellow guests. Like, can they handle that?
Yeah. And I would say to me, it works. Because you've positioned yourself as an educator, but you're the type of educator who is also learning as you go. In relationship to your audience, you have a certain level of authority in that you have studied this, you have made this your field of study, and there are things that you know that they may not know. And yet you're not an expert on all things sex and lifestyle. So there are things that you don't know that you're also learning. And so you do have authority, and that's the NPR voice. That's the intro that's setting it up. Therefore, I can trust you in terms of the things I'm learning and the content that you're providing me. And you also have the relatability of learning from your guests, not assuming that you know everything and being curious as well. And that's more of the conversational style that you have with your guests. So I think it works.
Okay, that's good to know.
Yeah.
I'm glad you're telling me this because I'm like, yeah, no, I'm never sure about that.
Yeah.
I've gotten more used to it now that the years have gone by, but yeah.
Yeah.
Well, and I think probably the most critical aspect of being a good interviewer is passion. Passion and curiosity, like genuine passion, genuine curiosity. These are really critical things. If you have a passion for the subject, if you have a passion for the interview that you're entering into, and a genuine curiosity, everything we just said does not matter.
Mic drop.
And scene.
And scene.
Podcast Envy is produced by your podcast boss, Andrea Klunder. That's me. The Podcast Envy theme music is by Valentin Sosnitsky, courtesy of the Free Sound Project at freesound.org, and our podcast Angel music is by Benjamin Mastropolito, also on freesound.org as Lemon Cream. All music is licensed under the Creative Commons. Our episodes are mixed by Edwin Ruiz, and hey, if you want your show to sound as good as ours, hire us. Put the magic audio mojo of the Creative Imposter Studios to work for you. Thanks so much for listening, and here's to making your podcast the envy of everyone else.